Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second debriefing from BEREC Plenary number 2 this year, 2020. My name is Dan Sjöblom. I'm the chair for BEREC this year. And as you will know, this debriefing is held virtually, which I think is a premiere, as well as we had our first completely virtual plenary last week. So we're keeping our fingers crossed that our planning and our technology will be with us for the afternoon. I'm sure it will be fine. This is exceptional times for all of us. Whilst we're learning a lot of things, this is also of course, hard times for some people. We should think of them as we go along, even if some statistics are looking a little bit better. So we are on virtual. We have had several virtual events, of course, since we moved over into the virtual sphere. We had a BEREC stakeholder forum in virtual format in April. And we're hoping very much to be able to have the physical part with all of you in October. We have had other working group virtual events during the spring, and there will be more virtual webinars in the upcoming future. So keep your eyes on the BEREC website for invitations to all of those. We, of course, think it's very important that we keep this up. We change formats, but we want to continue to interact and dialogue with all of you, our stakeholders. Now, over to the agenda for today. First, we will present the new BEREC Public Consultations. I will then give a little bit of an update on BEREC's work on COVID-19 pandemic issues, and I will also give a little bit of information about the work from the ad hoc working group for cybersecurity and 5G networks. Then Michelle, our incoming BEREC Chair, will present the BEREC Strategy for 2021 to 2025. And then we will move into working group presentations. First out will be the Planning and Future Trends working group that will give you an update on a report on the impact of 5G on regulation and the role of regulation in enabling 5G ecosystems. That will be followed by the Open Internet working group that will talk about the new guidelines on the implementation of the open internet regulation. And following that, we will have a first Q&A session with you. And there will be a second round of Q&As for the remaining topics at the end of the program. After the first Q&A, we move over to the Fixed Network Evolution Working Group, who will talk about a draft BEREC guideline on the criteria for consistent application of Article 61 of the code. Followed by the MEA Working Group, who will talk about co-investments, a draft BEREC guideline there as well, co-investment in high-capacity networks. Moving on from there, we will have the end user group who will inform us about a report on defining adequate broadband internet access services. And I believe the final program then will be the wireless network evolution group that will give an update on guidelines on public warning systems. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, we will again open the floor for questions. So that's the program. I will now move over to the consultations. We have 3 public consultations that are being launched. First, we have the one I mentioned a while ago on Article 61, consistent application of. The launch date for all of these consultations, as you see, is today. and this one will run until the 31st of July. The second document is a report on the impact of 5G on regulation and the role of regulation in enabling the 5G ecosystem. The same closing date applies for this consultation. And the third document is the one on the criteria for assessing co-investment in high-capacity networks. That will run with a longer deadline for answers until the 4th of September. So we take at least some measures to stagger responses and hope that you will excuse us for making some of you work a little bit over the summer. But that's a little bit unavoidable with the amount of guidelines that we have to produce this year. Moving on from that, COVID-19 pandemic measures. What is BEREC doing there? You know, we have this special reporting mechanism going for some time now on internet capacity and other national measures against the pandemic. For about 3 months, we have looked at the status of the internet capacity, reported the findings to the Commission. We've also put the findings on our website for anyone to use and refer to. And the result, as you know, is that we have seen traffic increasing with people working from home, lockdown, and so on. But operators in the EU have managed very well. No major congestion has really occurred. And I can also mention that we will now move over to, from the beginning of next month, to reporting less frequently than weekly. We'll see maybe monthly reporting or what we come up with, because the situation is very stable and there is not so much news on a weekly basis. And I want to take this opportunity, of course, to thank everyone who is watching and who has assisted in keeping the networks working so well for the first 3 months of this pandemic. It has been really good for society to be able to rely on electronic communication. So thank you very much. Another measure we have more recently started publishing is national measures relating to these tracing apps that are being used to trace cases of COVID-19. And this is now also included in the weekly updates that we publish. One item I have received questions on there is how zero rating of these tracing apps relate to the open internet regulation. And as far as I can say, I think that zero rating of these services were not very bandwidth consuming, capacity consuming. It makes a lot of sense, of course, from a health perspective, and I believe it is fully compliant with the open internet rules that we have. So whilst there appears to be a need for more information about this, there will be a separate Q&A published on the BEREC website on this very topic. So if you're interested, have a look at that. I will then move over to the work on cybersecurity. You know, we have since last year a working group looking at this. And the activity that is most ongoing at the moment and in the work program for BEREC for 2020 is to continue to collect some relevant information in this area. And what is about to start now is that we are launching a collection exercise on 2 of the strategic measures mentioned in the EU toolbox for cybersecurity. And these are strategic measures 5 and 6, and they relate to diversity of suppliers and strengthening the resilience of national networks. So there will be a data collection exercise carried out over the summer, and this will result in a fact-finding report which for the moment we are thinking of as internal use characterization. We will submit this to the Council NIS group, to ENISA and to the Commission. We'll see what sort of data can be collected. We'll see if it is possible to provide a public summary or some sort of summary of the result for public consumption. I think that would be useful, but that is yet to be decided. So this data will be collected until the end of August, and then we will be discussing it and producing this report in the early parts of the autumn. So that's the work immediately coming up in the cybersecurity working group. And with that, I end my preliminary remarks here and move over to the next topic on today's program. And then I will hand over to my friend and colleague, Michel van Bellingen, who is, as you know, the incoming chair for BEREC, and who will present the draft BEREC strategy and the outcome of the public consultation. Over to you, Michel.
Thank you very much, Dan, and welcome everybody. On this strategy, you know that we have engaged twice with stakeholders, first time during an initial call for early input last year, and then afterwards the public consultation, as you can see on the screen, and the names of the different respondents. And we will, of course, publish a summary of all those and the contributions as well. And I would like to thank all the respondents for their contributions. On the next slide, if you can go. Yes, thank you. Just let me tell you that one more thing about stakeholder engagement. BEREC would like to intensify this stakeholder engagement by introducing more two-stage consultations. But know that there is a price to pay for this. This will put an extra burden on BEREC's works and resources. So this will be evaluated later on and adapted if necessary. But this is our intention to intensify this engagement. Another element then referred to the COVID-19 crisis has demonstrated how connectivity is crucial for all society. And in this, BEREC's task is to remain vigilant, ensure that the measures taken remain pragmatic and subject to regular review as well. We will certainly draw conclusions afterwards. So for this strategy, I have just two more slides based on the different sections of the documents on this. For the general introduction, objectives and development, I can tell you that we received a very broad support on the 5 years terms and the strategy in general, and for our new mission statements as well from Telefonica, Ethno, Open Fiber and Huawei. Of course, as you can see on the screen, our core tasks remain to promote clear, predictable and harmonized rule in the area of telecommunications, and also ensuring a consistent implementation of the codes, which is a very important horizontal principle to this strategy. On the general context and development trends, it seems that we have not been mistaken, and the same applies for the goals towards a gigabit society. There were some concerns expressed on the transition to 5G, but we think that comments made on this transition to 5G are sufficiently covered to the strategy when it comes to elements like access to spectrum, backhaul infrastructure, and infrastructure sharing. On digital platform, some support has been expressed, but concerns as well. You know that is an important area of development for BEREC, and that we would like to contribute to this too, thanks to our ex-ante regulation expertise. This is something we would like to do definitely. On big data and AI, as we have no crystal ball, this may have numerous of yet unforeseen consequences, so it's a little hard to quantify at this stage, and this is something we probably need to revisit later on. Coming on the main changes we made in these sections. Actually, we have a new wording regarding to the bridging of the digital divide on the one hand, and we have had a new paragraph related to the COVID-19 situation, since this is a development that will have a strong impact on electronic communications network and on BEREC too. So on the next and last slide, please. Thank you. This refers to the 3 high-level strategic priorities. So in general, again, we received a broad support on those high-level strategic priorities, and all the stakeholders welcomed our ambition in sustainability and climate change, referring to the Green Deal of the European Commission. So more specifically to the 3 different high-level strategic priorities. Number 1, promoting full connectivities. So as you can see on the screen, yes, we understand the concern made about wholesale access, network sharing, and the availability of scarce resources. So in a development section, we've clearly indicated that an appropriate regulatory framework needs to be put in place to allow the development of connectivity. And we go for, as BEREC, a proportionate, consistent approach throughout Europe on the one hand, but we'll take also the national markets circumstances into consideration on the other end. Second element on this first high-level strategic priority, this strategy aims at an intensified institutional cooperation with other EU bodies like RSPG on the field on spectrum. This is something we would like to stress as well. On the second high-level strategic priority, supporting sustainable and open digital markets, we've received support from BEREC, Facebook, Digital Europe, on our commitment to the open internet for the benefit of all end users throughout Europe. But there is also concern coming from BEREC related to digitalization, which is not only provide opportunities, but there are also many challenges to be tackled. That's what we've understood. On the third and last high-level strategic priority, empowering end users, we've received a support from ETNO, GSMA, FTTH, Facebook, and BEREC. They welcome very much this concept of end user empowerment, and there is a common belief that protection rules should be applied in an harmonized way. So now I come to the different changes we made in the strategy related to this 3 high-level strategic priorities. So there is a slight change, as you can see on the screen, when you want to put a focus on improving the general conditions for both operators and users, which implicitly includes supply and demand side conditions. This is a reaction to one of the comments made by Liberty Global. Second element, in response to ACTAB and also others, we have included in the promotion of the take-up of very high capacity network by end user the business end users as well. So third element is the addition as a response to a comment made by GSMA related to wholesale access to fiber backhaul connectivity on cell side. Of course, this needs to be ensured because we need to prevent potential problems in terms of lack of coverage and refusal of access to bottlenecks facilities. Fourth element, BEREC confirms that, as mentioned earlier, that in the digital economy there are opportunities, but there are challenges as well. And as a last element, BEREC has had in our second high-level priority that we want to continue to build our knowledge base within the digital economy in close cooperation with other EU bodies and group as well, to make sure that from technological, economic, legal, and user protection perspective are well integrated in the design and in the practice of regulation. I thank you very much for your attention. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you, Michel. And I pass the word straight over to our first co-chair for PFT. I think it's Bert Claessens. Bert, you have the floor.
Also online with us. I'm here to present the radar on 5G. As the previous speaker has mentioned, 5G is one of the strategic priorities of BEREC, and BEREC has identified 5G as a strategic priority with the aim to enable European scale solutions, to promote competition, to being consistent with EU regulatory framework, and to help to reap the benefits of an early and coherent implementation of 5G in terms of innovation, productivity, and growth. In short, to make 5G a success. Any topic that may require regulatory attention. To that end, last year, BEREC has published a report on the impact of 5G on regulation and the role of regulation in enabling the 5G ecosystem. In that report, we leaned on input from stakeholders. We are very grateful for numerous input we got there. But we could not add a prioritization at that stage yet. And we have asked the board to, if we could keep on working on this report and make an extension of that. And we did that in with this visualization of the radar. So we have extracted the 23 most important developments in the 5G ecosystem that we see happening in the future, and we try to plot them with on basis of relevance and timing. And this visualization should help BEREC to plan the work on 5G. Maybe a few important things on this radar, how it works. The location, when it is timed, is based on the moment that BEREC or NRA should be ready for a certain development. It's not when we should start working on it, but when we should be ready. I mean, that's also the idea of a radar on a ship. You should steer well in advance. Relevance, some topics a bit further away from the center have a lower relevance, and that does not mean they are not important for BEREC. Actually, all the topics on the radar are important. The relevance is the relative importance of the different projects. It can also be that BEREC or NRAs are not the first regulator to be responsible for it, but there is also other regulators active in that field, for example, in case of privacy or spectrum. So my colleague was already demonstrating if the cursor slides over the smaller bulbs on the left side, the bigger circle is lighting up, giving a more elaborate explanation of the topic. So this radar serves as an input for our work programs in the future years, and we would like to ask stakeholders to comment on this in the public consultation that we'll be starting today. And we would like to hear from stakeholders if you feel that this radar is complete. We would love to hear if there is an important development missing. We would also like to know if the description of the different topics are accurate. And of course, the place of the bulbs on the radar to if we have made a proper indication of the relevance, the role of BEREC, and the timing when we should be ready for it. So 5G is a very important topic for BEREC, and we will keep involving stakeholders on this topic. And maybe this is a good moment also to announce the workshop that we had planned in March will probably take place in October. So, and if there are any further questions, we would love to answer them after the next speaker. On Open Internet, this is Michiel van Dijk and Klaus Niemin.
Thank you, Bert, for the introduction. So Klaus and I will spend a few words on the publishing of the Open Internet Guidelines. So as you may recall, over 2 years ago on this subject, we started with the first consultation, and since then several ways and moments of stakeholder engagement have followed. And we would like to thank you for your input. I think it has been very useful. So while we see that with the COVID-19 situation, the subject remains very much alive, we are still happy to close this updating of the guidelines at this moment. So we will present to you updated guidelines, the consultation report, including the public contributions and the updated website of BEREC. In this presentation, very shortly, I will take you through the public consultation as we experienced it. And Klaus will speak of the changes that we have made after the public consultation. So on the next slide, we see that there have been 52 contributions. 2 of them were confidential, so we have been able to publish the other 50. Our overall impression is that stakeholders are generally appreciating the new guidelines. So in the consultation report, we will focus on the remaining points that stakeholders wanted to address, and this mainly concerns the clarification of the new texts. So the text that was new in the last public consultation. We note that on certain topics like zero rating and specialized services, there's still a divide within the stakeholders. And I think it's good to recall that this is an updating exercise, so we did not seek to rebalance, if you like, the 2016 guidelines. Therewith, I would like to hand over to Klaus for the next slide.
Thanks. As said, we received many substantial, well-written comments that demonstrated a need for further clarifications. This slide presents the changes done after the public consultation, and we wanted to list also the minor changes to make it easier for you to follow what has been done. One of the main topics was what's in and what's out of the scope of the regulation. An example of closed user group services was added, the private M2M networks, for example, in factories and ports. Also, the endpoint-based services were clarified, meaning the functions at the destination of the IP address provided by the end-user computer. That an ISP can offer these services the same way as the CAPs can, in addition to the Internet Access Service. Also, the examples were clarified. Now the additional DNS resolvers and HTTP proxy servers. We clarified the term application agnostic regarding the provision of quality of service levels, different quality of service levels. Meaning in a nutshell, any application may populate any quality of service level as selected by the end user. So this is our end user controlled part. We have clarified our guidance regarding open zero rating programs and the assessment methodology. I want to point out that the annex is not meant to supersede or replace the text in the actual guideline body part. Thank you from our side. That was all. Dan, please, could you take the floor?
Thank you, co-chairs. And with that, we had intended to have a 15-minute opportunity for questions on the presentations that you have heard so far. There are some people who have signed up to ask live questions. If you are in that category, please go into the chat part of the presentation and write your name and affiliation, and I'll allocate the floor in good order as long as we can over this time. We have a first question from Oliver Fugg from ICTA. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you to all the speakers for the presentations that you have graced us with today. I would like to focus my question on a particular topic within the strategy work line that you are engaging upon now with the publication of the new strategy for the next 5-year period. And that concerns the platform work that BEREC is planning to do. We had understood from the work program that you had published last year that actually a consultation on a report would be launched today on a report on market and economic issues of digital platforms. And it seems that this consultation is actually not going ahead. At the same time, you place some emphasis on this, and the European Commission has 2 weeks ago published a number of consultations that will also deal with platform regulation, notably from an ex-ante perspective, in the context of the Digital Services Act package. I therefore wanted to ask you what is going to become of this report. What opportunities for participation from electronic communications providers will there be? And how do you specifically intend to contribute, if at all, to the Commission's consultations on this work? Are you planning to make a contribution to the consultation yourself? And if so, will you be giving stakeholders the possibility to contribute upfront, especially if the report, isn't yet finished? So those were my questions on the topic of platform regulation and BEREC's role in that. Thank you.
So I understand from the questioner, it's a question on the strategy. Michel, do you want to tackle this?
Yes, then thank you very much, and thank you, Oliver, for your question. I will try to answer the different aspects you mentioned. For the time being, the priority is on the work to be done to react to the documents of the European Commission to mention. So this will be a BEREC opinion only, without engagement of stakeholders. As you know, this is something we need to get ready by the very beginning of the month September. And later on, because of this COVID-19 situation, there is some work which has to be shifted to plenary 3 and 4. There will be room to interact with stakeholders. But so yes, we will react as BEREC. We will adopt a position on this document published by the Commission, but without engagement of with stakeholders at this stage, but later on. Over to you, Dan.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a second person in the chat who wants to ask a question. Kate Neyman, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you so much for hosting this virtual debrief. I had a quick question on the post-COVID recovery work that we're seeing member states as well as the European Commission, of course, with their 750 billion proposal for a recovery plan for Europe. Extent is BEREC, and how do you see BEREC's role in supporting the European Commission as well as the national governments as they're developing these recovery plans, in particular in regards to providing sufficient public funding for rural broadband and 5G in those areas where we don't necessarily have the market for the private investment?
Okay, thank you very much for that question. I can start and see if some of the colleagues wants to join me. Of course, you know that the work we're doing on the risk of congestion is coming from the European Commission. We have a joint statement with them. We're also, of course, talking to our friends at the Commission regularly, and we discussed, for example, the impact on open internet and tracing apps. So that's one of the reasons that I wanted to mention something about that in my opening statement here. So we have a very open and ongoing dialogue with the colleagues at the European Commission. And should there be other areas where the Commission feels that BEREC can be of use, and if we do think we have the capacity to provide assistance, we will of course continue to do so. It's also something that we have in the work program, I think every year. We certainly have it this year, that there should be capacity in the organization to assist as items come up from the European Commission or from Parliament or Council. Those bodies are very important to us, of course. And then I think all of us have different national portfolios, if you want. Some of us are more perhaps involved in many areas of work of our national governments. So that depends a little bit on the difference between our different bodies. I mean, I can take my own organization. PTS is in many ways assisting other bodies, from the health bodies to the public safety bodies to of course, governmental bodies in preparing different aspects of COVID recovery plans. And if there are funds available for increasing connectivity with broadband or other measures, we would, of course, all be happy to assist in ensuring that those are rolled out in a way that is, where the money does the best use and distorts the market as little as possible. I think that's the general plan we would have at this stage. I don't know if any of the colleagues wants to add to that. If not, maybe I'll move on. We have no more questions in the chat. I do have one question that was submitted to us prior to this discussion from MVNO Europe, who wants to know, and I think the question goes to the PFT working group. They have a question on the impact of 5G regulation and the role of regulation in enabling 5G ecosystem. Does it take the wholesale dimension into account, and in this respect promote access to 5G to avoid the delay problems that MVNO operators observed with 3G and 4G transitions? So I suppose the question goes to Bert, who I hope is still with us.
Yes, I'm still there now. Thank you. The wholesale dimension is covered in the theme new business models and value chains. Radar shows 23 developments, and they are clustered by colors, and the red color shows, I think, 4 developments, and the wholesale dimension is covered in those ones.
Okay. Are you done? That's it?
I'm done, yeah.
Yep, thank you very much. Okay, so at this stage, I don't have any more questions either sent to us in advance or in the chat room. So I think we'll actually carry on with the program and leave a little bit more time for questions in the end. And with that, I'm handing over to Björn Jonassen from Venezia, who will talk about the draft guidelines for Article 61.
Hello, sorry. I think I'm now unmuted. Thanks a lot. Today the draft BEREC guidelines on the criteria for consistent application of Article 61.3 ECC will be published for consultation. And 61.3 ECC provides the NRAs with an extended and amended framework on symmetric access regulation. The draft guidelines will define criteria on key aspects of the symmetric access regulation. And I'm going to introduce just the major aspects on the key aspects. So the first, concentration and distribution point, is not an entirely new concept, but we did some more concise regulation basically on it. And so we found that this point would be technologically neutral, defined at the first point that is accessible or can be made reasonably accessible with unreasonable effort for the access seeker. The second aspect are the high non-transitory or economic or physical barriers to replication, which are going to be addressed by the guidelines or by the access regulation. And we find that economic barriers stem largely from a low prospect of cost recovery, especially because of high sunk costs, because of civil engineering deployment. The physical barriers may derive from technical, legal, or administrative restrictions and physical obstacles, thus leading to a broad definition of the term physical barriers. Next slide, please. Thank you. And the point beyond, which is the point meant to define, to overcome those high and non-transitory barriers identified, is the point closest to the end user that provides for a commercially viable business case. With regards to the key aspects on the exemptions from this access regulation, we find that network deployments that are considered to be new aims to recently deployed networks where service provision started no longer than 5 years ago. Network deployments considered to be small aims to projects by undertakings not active in a major part of the broadband market. And the size of the undertaking should be measured relative to the broadband market. As a presumption, we have the opinion that undertakings with less than 500 potential end users are in any case regarded as being small. Next slide, please. And generally, the draft guidelines are defined in accordance with Article 61.3 ECC, and also inform on how the criteria defined need to be applied. The next steps will be a stakeholder meeting to introduce those draft guidelines, which will be carried out on the 23rd of June, next Tuesday. And the public consultation will be open until the 31st of July. Thanks a lot.
So I will proceed. So good afternoon, everybody. So here you are, another set of guidelines, in this case for Article 76 about co-investment agreements. And if you can move to the next slide. Okay. As you know, Article 76 deals with the regulatory treatment of new very high capacity networks in regards to co-investments offers made by SMP operators. And in this article, in the paragraph 1, it is said the conditions that NRAs should assess or must assess for these commitments in order not to impose any additional obligation under Article 68 regarding that elements of the new very high capacity networks. And Annex 4 must be read in conjunction with this paragraph because it sets the minimum criteria for the commitments. So Article 79 is the procedure to assess the commitment, but according to the code, BEREC has to prepare the guidelines for paragraph 1 and Annex 4, that it's really 2 pages. We have done 30 pages of guidelines because we have gone through the different terms and different conditions, trying to clarify in order to allow for consistency when applying by NRAs. So if you move to the next slide, well, on the previous steps, some of you who are following this debriefing were in these meetings. We had 2 meetings with the stakeholders. First, last year, focus on the issues to be addressed, to have a clear idea on potential concerns of what should be clarified, etc. And 3 months ago, we had a second workshop to hear different views from different organizations. So here you are, the key points addressed. I mean, it's all we saw and so we heard from you that could be issues that would need clarification, aim for consistency in issues as what is considered a new very high capacity network, the timing for making an offer, type of investments qualifying. And when addressing the different issues, when we have done with, when applicable, is to apply to different models of co-investment agreement. That doesn't necessarily means that we consider only these three models, but it are the 3 models of reference in the regulation and are the ones that are most likely to be applied. So as you can see, we have addressed the issue on what is fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms. What do we mean by that flexibility on the participation by co-investors, possibility to increase participation, and the information that it must be made public in advance. Okay. So if you move to the next slide, well, as you have probably seen, we have already opened it to public consultation. You have the guidelines in the BEREC website. You are invited to submit any input because we will have further discussion. There are some guidelines where we know that there will be input, and for sure we will have discussion on what we will hear from you. As you have seen for this one, you have a bit more time to allow you to plan how you will provide feedback on the different guidelines. So this one can be answered till 4th of September. And based on that, we will have our internal discussion, and the idea is to approve the final version at plenary 4, because this will enter into force at the end of the year. And same as in other guidelines, we will publish a summary of our contributions, And if you want to provide any feedback, confidential feedback, etc., please mark it, just not to be published. And that is all from our side. Chiara, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, perfect for me.
Okay. Okay.
Hello, I'm Paolo Lupi, one of the co-chairs of the BEREC End User Working Group. I'm now going to present the BEREC report on member states' best practices to support the defining of broadband internet access services. This is an activity which started in 2019 when we began to analyze the experiences of those countries which are already included broadband access within the scope of universal service. We drafted a consultation document that was submitted for public consultation it was approved at the fourth plenary on 19 and submitted public consultation from the 11th of December to 27th of January 2020. This is the final report that takes into account the comments of the stakeholders. I would like to remind that this report is a requirement of Article 84 of the European Electronic Communication Code, which, in order to contribute and promote consistency among member states in the inclusion of broadband within the scope of universal services, gives to BEREC the task of drawing up a report on the best practices of those member countries that, in order to support the definition of adequate broadband internet service. The report, as required by the code, has been drafted in close cooperation with the Commission and taking into account Commission and Eurostat data. Member states will then define the adequate broadband services on the basis of national circumstances and take into account this BEREC report, considering also that the adequate internet access services shall be capable of delivering the services which are included in Annex 5 of the code, which sets a minimum set of services like email, internet access to job searching tools, social media, instant messaging calls, and video calls of standard quality. The report starts with a survey of the relevant legislation and of the relevant European Commission documents like COCOM documents and documents concerned with the revision of the universal services, and it, on the basis of the experiences of 9 member countries, of those 9 member countries which have already included broadband within universal service, tries to set some common principles, like some related to the bandwidth and the quality of services, but also evaluation criteria, which is the area of the report where the report mostly focuses on the designation mechanism, on monitoring system, and on affordability measures and funding of universal service. And it also contains some recommendation for future reports. Next slide, please. As I was saying, it includes the experiences of 9 countries, namely Belgium, Croatia, Finland, Latvia, Malta, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. We can see that there is some variability in the speeds that have been considered as adequate for the broadband internet access services. These also probably may depend by the time that these speeds were set. As you can see, those countries which have set more recently, have included more recently broadband within universal service, are those which also have set the highest speed. There's not only a couple of countries like Slovenia and the United Kingdom set some upload speeds. As you can see, the main criteria considered by the member states are the expected availability of broadband without public intervention, geographic surveys, market distortion, where the data rate is used by at least 50% of households, at least 80% of households with a broadband connection. You will be able to recognize within this criteria also some criteria which were set in some other European Commission document. This comes with no surprise, since this report contains experiences of countries which have included broadband under the current regulatory framework. This is, of course, a peculiarity of this report, that having been drafted before the transposition of the code, could only rely on the experiences of a limited number of countries which operated under the previous regulatory framework. The report will be regularly updated, and of course will include also the experiences of the countries that, following the transposition of the code, will include broadband within the universal service. Next slide, please. We received comments from all 8 stakeholders, namely IRE, Fastware, GSMA, Equinor, Liberty Global, Open Fiber, Pike, Ripen, and Sisivo, and the Vodafone Group. The comments of the stakeholders focused on that list of topics that you can find the right-hand side of the slide, and in particular, therefore, that broadband should be technology neutral when included within the EU. So broadband universal service option should be limited to primary residents. There should be no delay in compensating designated universal service provider for the provision of universal service, and that universal service should be publicly funded. And then some comments also on the fact that the concept of affordability and availability should be considered separately. All comments were addressed, and this resulted in a number of changes to the document. In other cases, we clarified that the issues mentioned were already addressed in other parts of the document, and in other cases, we also taught and explained that the issues were outside the scope of the best practices report. With this, I think that it's all. I would like to pass the floor to Blaise and Joe.
Thank you very much, Paolo. My name is Joe Lynch, and I'm from Comreg, one of your points of contact for the Wireless Network Evolution Group. Of the 12 code-related guidelines this year, this is a special set of guidelines in that no NRA has the competence for the public warning system in their member state. And there are 4 things that I like about the guidelines. So the first is that they are technology neutral. So we are at the final stage here. So we have received over 20 contributions from civil protection authorities and providers of public warning system solutions. So we had to cut through the marketing material and remain objective, and we've done that. The second thing I like about the guidelines are that they give a qualitative information for readers. So the code is not very specific and doesn't give very much guidance on what is meant by capacity to reach end users. So these guidelines give 10 factors that describe capacity to reach end users. The third thing I like about the guidelines is the timing. So now more than ever, it is important that this information that we've gathered on qualitative information about public warnings is made available. And the fourth and final thing about the guidelines that I like is that it does not allow for green lighting any old public warning system. And there's a framework in place, and only those really effective public warning systems would be implemented. So essentially, when we look at the slide here and we talk about public warnings, we're really talking about safety of life. And in the era of connectivity, we're moving towards more mobile type warning systems, be it SMS, location-based SMS, cell broadcasting systems, or even over-the-top internet application-based systems. But there are also still a number of legacy type systems still in place, be it bells and sirens and broadcasts, and indeed hybrid systems. So if we go to the next slide. So essentially, the kernel of this comes from the code, and it's Article 110 of the code. Paragraph 1 of Article 110 says that member states must ensure that warnings are transmitted to all end users in areas concerned using mobile-based systems, be it, we've taken the interpretation, be it an SMS, a location-based SMS system, or a cell broadcast system. But paragraph 2 of the code allows member states to transmit those warnings using an internet type system, so an application-based system or an app system, so long as it's as effective as either a location-based SMS or a cell broadcast system. So, and BEREC is to produce guidelines to assist member states ensure that any such system would be as effective. So it's a comparison of systems. So we've put in place a framework. If we go to the next slide. So it's essentially a 3-step methodology. And there's a preliminary step for the member state or the competent authority to select a system that would comply with the code in the first instance. And then step 1 is to actually check the performance of that system against the factors that BEREC has identified for coverage and capacity to reach end users. And it goes without saying, 3 of the most important factors are: you must be able to geographically target the warnings, so send them to the area where the warnings are needed. You must be able to do so quickly, so it's scalability. They must be received quickly by the end user. And it must also accommodate for those who are temporarily in that area concerned, so be it the visiting roamers or roamers in general. So step 1 is that they check that the system that they have would comply with the code. Then they check the performance of that system against the factors BEREC has identified. And then in step 2, now for a member state who may be intending to deploy an app-based system, they must check the performance of the app-based system against those factors. Okay, that's step 2. And then the final step is a comparison between both systems. And only those systems that are equivalent in terms of the effectiveness to reach end users concerned may be deployed by the member state. So that's essentially what's in our guidelines, and the call for action now is for people to read the guidelines and hopefully exchange information in relevant fora on how to ensure that all public warning systems across Europe are of highly effective and of a good standard. So now I think I have to pass back to the chair, and thank you for listening to our presentation.
So thank you very much to all co-chairs for those very clear presentations of the various items. We have now come to our second Q&A part. Again, to those of you who are able to write in the chat, please go ahead and do so. We have one question in the Q&A, and that's for Björn. It's a clarification question from Oliver Fugg. I can read it out, I think. It's about is it 5 years from the date of applicability of the code, is the question in the chat. I don't know if Björn is able to comment or confirm that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. The 5 years is not to be interpreted in a way that it is a very strict period of time with regards to recently deployed networks, but rather that we came to the conclusion that networks that are in service provision longer than 5 years are certainly not recently deployed. So it might, depending on the national circumstances, an array might conclude that the period of time might also be shorter. And of course, with regards to the code, we have to define the criteria on what is to be considered new. And taking into account also the recitals of the provision, we came to the conclusion that the exemptions are meant to protect recently deployed or new networks, in the sense of networks which are still have the need to get customers on the network and to get a profitable business case. So that's basically how we got to this result. Thank you.
Thank you, Björn. I think that answers the question. I have no further questions in the chat, so I'm going to read out a couple of questions that have been sent to us by email. We have one question on the high-capacity networks, and it comes from Tim, addressed then to the co-chairs of MEA. It starts with Article 76, which states that co-investment shall be open at any moment during the lifetime of the network to any provider of electronic communication networks or services. And the first question is how BEREC is concretely defining the lifetime and the co-investment conditions in order to have a consistent application throughout countries. And there's a second part to that question, which is Annex 4 provides that conditions to join the co-investment should vary over time, among other things, to reflect the different levels of risk accepted by the individual co-investors. And the question is, how should the risk component be factored in? So I hope that our co-chairs have some insight into this and can provide a good response.
Yes, thank you very much, Dan. So I will start with the first part of the question, and Jorge will take over. So concerning the lifetime of the network, it is indeed there are different approaches when assessing the lifetime, as for instance the technical and commercial lifetime of the network. And for the purpose of Article 76, we consider that the lifetime of the network can only be understood with reference to the commercial co-investment scheme, so the commercial lifetime of the network, and during which the network is fully operative. So the expected commercial lifetime of the co-investment scheme should be included also in the proposal made by the SMP operator, since this would be important to inform a decision on the exemptions that the NRA would take when assessing the co-investment offer. And I'll give the floor to Jorge for the next question.
Thank you, Chiara. And about the issue on the factoring of the risks, in principle, we are not envisaging any formula or kind of algorithm to assess that, because there can be many different factors, difficult to put in a formula. In any case, we are open to hear from stakeholders on ideas on how to go further, at least clarifying on what kind of risk we consider, etc. We are open to go further. Probably we are not able to factor just in a formula, but in any case, we could go further. I'm happy to receive any input on that.
Okay, thank you very much, both. I think that answers the question well. I'll continue with some other questions. And if you're, in the meantime, listening to this, please don't hesitate to write your questions into the chat. We had a question from Sky EU, who wants to know if BEREC is doing anything in terms of providing guidance on perhaps allowing delays in the implementation of the code. And that's a fairly easy one to answer. That's not a BEREC competence. Implementing EU rules is the responsibility of member states, and it's up to the European Commission to ensure that member states comply with their obligations under the treaties. We also had a question from Orange, who is asking for information about a report we had indeed on the plenary that has not been explained here in the discussion so far on the WACC parameters, and wondering if BEREC could share the data approved. I don't know if we have the co-chair from that group on the call. I'm guessing no. So then I'll say that we are at the moment finalizing the report, and we will of course make that document available as soon as it is possible, and then we will include as much data as we think we need to include to support the findings of that document. So that will come on our document screens as soon as it can be made available. You are being fairly passive at the chat room, I must say. Maybe all the presentations were just that crystal clear today that... Oliver has a question to Jorge. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thanks for accepting one more question. Thank you also for the presentation of the draft guidelines on co-investment. One question that sprang to mind in this context was the following. You very clearly identified in the initial slides that set out the legal framework for the elaboration of these guidelines, the link between Articles 76 and 79. And what I have been able to see from the consultation document by quickly scanning it, it seems that the working group has not explicitly addressed, let's say, the procedural aspects of Article 79 at any depth. And I would therefore like to ask you whether BEREC intends to set out guidance or a common understanding of how this procedure should operate going forward. Linked there to the question would be, does BEREC at this point agree to the considerations that the European Commission set out in its consultations on the procedural recommendation or the evolving Article 7 recommendation? Thank you very much.
And should I ask?
Please go ahead.
Okay. Well, first of all, you're right, Oliver. I mean, we didn't even try to address the procedural aspects because we had clearly the obligation on paragraph 1 and annex 4, and that is what we have focused as now. About preparing any guidelines or common positions or clarifications on that procedural issues, in principle, we haven't at this stage planned for that. It's an issue that we may consider. We are now analyzing the work plan for next year and the following, but we haven't planned. We have, in any case, answer to the Commission on that public consultation on procedural aspects. I think that is public, our response, and we have addressed some issues, but it's not the same as clarifying all the aspects on procedural issues for Article 76. So we have provided feedback to the Commission on some aspects, but in principle, right, we are not addressing here. For the future, it's an issue that we may consider, but haven't still planned.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to read out the last Q&A I have from the emails. So unless we get some activity in the chat, we're going to be approaching the end very soon. That's just a message for all of you out there. There's a question from, again, MVNO Europe about if BEREC is thinking about doing more work following up the report from 2018 on the effect of devices on the open use of internet. And there I can say that we will, of course, deal, as you heard, with the DSA. We have reports coming on the platform economy. We have a study coming up on the consumer experience of platforms. And in the outline for the work program for 2021, there is a possible item on the internet value chains, but of course the work program for 2021 is still work in progress, so it's not something that is already decided. So that's the various areas we may come close to following up on that report, and that's, I think, all I have to say on that at the moment. Oliver wants to know the time frame for the BEREC study. The BEREC study has been going through public procurement. I'm not exactly sure where it is at the moment, but it's close to being attributed, I think, if not already, and I think it will be delivered in final format sometime in the spring of next year. So still some time away. So I don't see at the moment any more questions out there. I will give it 5 more seconds. Counting down. Okay, so thank you all very much for participating in the first ever fully virtual debriefing meeting from a BEREC plenary. I think it worked really well. Thank you very much to BEREC office for providing a very stable environment to do this. Thank you for everyone who asked questions, both live and in the email versions. Thank you very much to all the co-chairs for clear and concise presentations. Next time we do this, we hope, of course, that the world is back to a little bit more normal, so we can do things live if we choose to do so. But I think none of us knows what is in front of us in terms of development of the pandemic and the advice we all get from our health authorities. We, of course, have to think about health first and foremost. So with that said, again, my thanks to everyone for participating. I want to wish you all a nice and relaxing summer, and stay well and healthy. Thank you very much. Goodbye.